Hello, my name is Michael Tillotson. I am an author, and these are my 2 books, right here. They're pretty swell if I do say so myself, but I may be just a little bit biased. Today, I want to talk about a potential risk when it comes to creating your story that I don't think I've seen talked about before, and that's the risk of changing the setting of your book or whatever media. This is mostly applying to things like sequels or season 2s, etc., but it would theoretically apply if you're just shifting in the middle of your book as well. This idea of changing the setting when you enter a sequel isn't a radically new idea or anything. It happens all the time. Sometimes it's a literal shift in location, like going from Ender Lilies, which took place in Land's End, to Ender Magnolia, which took place in an entirely separate kingdom called the Land of Fumes. Other times you can have it be set somewhere that's technically the same location, but the world or the location has changed so much from entry to entry that it might as well be a new location. I was going to use Avatar: The Last Airbender as an example to this, but then I realized Team Korra doesn't often visit the same areas that Team Aang did. The South Pole, I guess, would be the best example of this. When you do this shift for a short period of time, or even if it does last a while, if you at least give the preface that it's going to be a temporary thing, it's not usually a big deal. In Steven Universe, for instance, there's an entire plot arc where the characters relocate to the barn for a while, but we knew they'd be heading back to Beach City as soon as they were done with what they were doing out there. But when you shift the setting and your audience is under the impression that this shift is permanent, you run the risk of upsetting and possibly alienating your audience. So let's just take a moment to talk about why and how the issue could potentially be lessened. So, Star vs. the Forces of Evil is a show roughly divided into 2 halves. The first 2 seasons take place on Earth, while the latter 2 seasons take place on the titular character Star's home dimension, Muni. I really enjoyed both halves of the show, but I remember on my first watch, ever since the plot moved to Muni, something felt very off. When I rewatch the show now, it doesn't really bother me, but I do always remember how it felt. There were 2 big things I noticed that made the show feel this way. The first is kind of a special case, somewhat niche, and it won't apply to a lot of stories, but up until this point in the story, Muni has been a sort of noodle incident, which, if you're unfamiliar with the term, Overly Sarcastic Productions made a great video on it, but the general idea is a noodle incident is something that is purposefully not fully explained, so that our imaginations will fill in the gaps. Before the second half of the show, we didn't really know what Muni was like. We knew a little bit, but it was a very incomplete picture. Muni was built up in our heads as this incredibly dangerous land filled with magic and monsters, where anything and everything was trying to kill you. When the plot actually transitioned to Muni, though, our perceptions changed a little bit, The general danger of Muni was significantly played down, and it seemed a lot safer than we had been led to believe. Muni stopped feeling so outlandish and alien. To some extent, this may have been intentional. After all, a good chunk of Star's plotline was shattering our preconceived notions of the world, but it didn't really seem like that was the intention. It seemed more like, since the entire plot took place on Muni now, they couldn't focus on those wild aspects of Muni as much because they were, focusing on the plot. If the audience knows about the place that the story will eventually transition to at its setting, then to some extent you're going to inevitably run into this issue where your audience's mental image of what this other place is like is going to come into conflict with the way this other place actually is. And you can use this to your advantage if you play it right. There's a little bit at the beginning of Raya and the Last Dragon, and I know the movie wasn't super popular, but opinions on the rest of the movie notwithstanding, there's a fun bit in its intro where Rhea's dad asks her to tell him about the other 4 nations, and when she does, he's all like, "Yeah, you're stereotyping. Stop that." If it's intentional and shattering these stereotypes is the goal of your story, then great. But if that's not your intention, insert Gaius Van Belsar meme here, then you need to keep in mind it's going to happen regardless. And if the image of this other location is too different than what the story has built it up to be, then there's going to be some dissonance on what your audience is expecting to see and what they actually get, which can potentially push them away from the story. The important thing to avoid with this issue is just to make sure what the audience is about to experience in this new location lines up with the way you've been building it up in the story, keeping in mind that your audience has most likely exaggerated the details in their head. The other big thing that always jumps out at me from this big setting switch that happens in Star is the roster of side characters completely changes. In the early seasons, there are a lot of side characters who live on Earth, like Miss Skolnick, Starfan 13, Margot's parents, Oscar, and most notably Jackie. But once the show transitions over to Muni, all of these characters kind of just fall out of the plot. They'll get a name drop here and there, but that's just about it. But I like these characters, and I like their character development and the plot lines that came along with them, you know? When you do this big setting swap, you can usually bring along your main cast pretty easily, but if you've had a consistent roster of side characters throughout your story, then your audience is going to get attached to them. And bringing along your entire roster of side characters usually isn't feasible, you know? And there's a not insignificant chance, if you're removing a bunch of your side characters like this, then you may be cutting out a good chunk of your audience's favorite character. And don't get me wrong, by reducing the amount of side characters like this, you can introduce new characters or give some of your side characters who could come along to the new location some more time in the spotlight, and that's exactly what Star did, and the plot lines associated with these changes are fun. But that doesn't really change the fact that a lot of the characters who I also liked just aren't there anymore. And it especially stings if it ever feels like any given side character had a plot arc that was going somewhere and just didn't ever feel like it reached a conclusion, or that the conclusion it did reach just wasn't satisfying. Unlike the last issue, I'm not really sure there is anything you can do to ease this up. You could potentially pick a few side characters who can come along to the new location with the main cast, and if you have the data, you could make sure those characters who do are like the fan favorites. But ultimately, if you're moving your story to a new location, the people who live in the old location are going to get left behind, and this can be a bit of a bummer to your audience. The third big risk you take when you change settings is probably the most obvious one. When you hear people talk about going from Avatar: The Last Airbender to The Legend of Korra, one of the big things you often hear people say is that the more technologically advanced world of Korra threw them off. That's not usually the way they phrase it, but I often find what they're trying to say is that the tone of the show just didn't feel the same, because of course, the setting you place your story in radically shifts the tone. I didn't feel this way with Korra, but I do understand where they're coming from, because I had this same feeling when it came to Ender Magnolia. Its predecessor, Ender Lilies, was set in a very medieval world, but Magnolia sets you in a different kingdom which was much more technologically advanced. In a lot of ways, Ender Magnolia's world has a very similar tone to Ender Lilies. It's a fallen kingdom where things feel overall pretty hopeless and depressing, but by setting it to the backdrop of machinery and homunculi, it felt very different to the stone castles and blighted undead of Lilies. And one of the issues here is some people just like certain aesthetics better, and the aesthetic of the first entry in the series is most likely going to be part of what drew them in, so when it changes, they're going to lose that grip. But even besides that, I actually find the aesthetic of Ender Magnolia to be a lot better and more unique than its predecessor, but the shift in aesthetic was just so jarring that it put me off at first. I'm the kind of person who can look past this kind of thing very quickly, because how the world advances in however much time, or how one kingdom handled some deadly magic compared to another, are really interesting to me. But stories of people who dropped Korra solely based on the more technologically advanced world are very common, and it's incredibly difficult to convince someone of this mindset to just get over that hurdle and give the show a chance. From my experience, the people of this mindset are kind of extreme about it, so I'm not sure there's a lot you can do to help, but one thing that I appreciate in these situations is a reminder that this is still the same world, you know? In Ender Magnolia, the Land of Fumes is a lot more technologically advanced than Land's End, sure, but they're dealing with the same issues that Land's End was in the first game. The Blight, how to purify it, and the morality of what that means. I think when it comes to Korra, the thing that's so baffling to a lot of people is it kind of led with Avatar in a more technologically advanced world, and then started getting more into Amon and the actual plot happening after that, when maybe I think it should have done it the other way around. I would be curious to get a glimpse into an alternate timeline where we meet Amon and Tarlok first, and then get introduced to Republic City to see if that helped. All in all, though, these are more just issues to be aware of if you decide to take your story and transfer it into a new setting from one that's already been established. A lot of great stories need this kind of setting shift to tell the story they want to tell, and that's great. All three of the examples I've used here, Star, The Legend of Korra, Ender Magnolia, they're all amazing, and their stories and their worlds are great. I love them. But I'm an author, and as an author, I think critically about a lot of these things that a more casual audience just doesn't. When I see a story do something that radically changes the story or the world in some way, like transferring us to a new location, my first thought is I want to see where the writer is going with this. I want to know why they did this big change and probably just jot it down in another annoying video essay like this one. But a more casual audience might just think, ugh, I don't like this new change. Can we just go back to the way it used to be? A lot of people just don't really like change, and in some ways, people occasionally look to stories to find somewhere that doesn't change. Like, sure, there's a plot happening here, but the core cast is going to remain the same, the world is going to remain the same, the tone is going to remain the same. So when something comes in and changes things too much for their liking, it can make them uncomfortable. The most infamous example I've seen of this is always Luke Skywalker in Episode 8 of the new Star Wars series. In the original trilogy, Luke was a Paragon hero, but as time went on, he started to lose sight of his morals to the point where he almost killed his own nephew. And he ultimately wound up as this fallen hero figure. I'll put my own opinion on this plotline to the side for now, lest I have an army of angry Star Wars fans at my doorstep, but the amount of people who absolutely hate this idea that their Paragon could possibly have a downfall arc is a perfect example of what I mean. People wanted Luke to stay the same, and when he didn't, they got angry. I personally think shifting the location of your story can be fun, but it's definitely something you don't want to do lightly. I wish I had somewhere else I could put this camera, and I totally would have done like a little joke where I'm filming in another location or something, but I literally don't have anywhere else I can put this thing, so that joke sadly can't come to fruition. But that's all from me, and I'll see you in another video.